Bueno, y un privilegio también, que duda cabe, el ser el primero en tomar la palabra en una cita académica tan importante como la que nos congrega hoy, un simposio en torno, como todos ustedes saben, a las maquetas y réplicas del patrimonio arquitectónico español en un amplísimo periodo del 1752 a 1929. Este simposio se celebra aproximadamente un año después, y quizá incluso exactamente un año después del encuentro que tuvimos en el Casón del Buen Retiro, en formato de encuentro científico sobre este mismo asunto, de modo que asistimos a una réplica de aquel encuentro, pero una réplica ampliada, reforzada, digamos que se propone también servir para madurar y establecer un nexo mayor entre todos los interesados en este asunto de gran interés en el estudio y en la investigación. El Museo del Prado es receptor de una propuesta universitaria del proyecto de investigación I+D que quien dirige también este simposio, la profesora García Esteve de la Universidad de Barcelona, bueno, de la Politécnica de Barcelona, es receptor por diversas razones. Una muy importante es, desde luego, por la enorme calidad de las aportaciones y del proyecto, y también por ser un lugar particularmente sensible al tema. El Casón del Buen Retiro, donde celebramos el encuentro científico el año pasado, fue, como ustedes saben, sede del Museo de Reproducciones Artísticas. En el museo se conservan piezas importantísimas, como la maqueta de Juan de Villanueva o como el modelo del sepulcro de Colón, de Arturo Mélida, entre tantísimas otras piezas que podrían ser objeto de consideración en el simposio, y algunas de ellas, de hecho, algunos de estos aspectos lo son. Es decir, que es una oportunidad excelente para la comunicación entre universidad y museo, entre nueva investigación y también repertorio de obras pendientes de mejor estudio en el museo y en, digamos, esto que tanto nos importa, la consideración de las réplicas, de los modelos en relación al conocimiento del patrimonio arquitectónico de España. Bueno, muy especialmente quiero dar las gracias a la profesora García Estevez por toda su aportación, por todo lo que se ha esforzado, conectado, etc. Ha sido un trabajo muy sencillo, muy fácil con ella, por su seriedad y por su pasión también por el tema. Y desde luego aprovecho esta breve introducción para agradecer a todos los ponentes que van a participar hoy y mañana por haberse dejado seducir y por enriquecer nuestro conocimiento en estos días. Así que ahora escuchamos a Carolina.
Muchas gracias, Javier. Las palabras que una coordinadora de un proyecto de investigación puede dirigir en el acto que finalmente concluye ese proyecto no son más que palabras de gratitud. Y en mi caso me gustaría destacar, en primer lugar, la complicidad que el Museo Nacional del Prado ha mostrado desde el inicio por acoger estas jornadas, primero de estudio y luego el simposio, que se encarnan evidentemente en las palabras del profesor Arnaldo y muy especialmente por la labor que el Centro de Estudios realiza gracias a su dirección. En segundo lugar, las palabras de gratitud se hacen extensivas también a todos los investigadores del proyecto, que creyeron desde un primer momento en él, y prueba de ello es su presencia aquí hoy con todos nosotros. Estoy convencida de que sus contribuciones a lo largo de estos 2 días van a ser substanciales para precisamente esbozar un episodio de la historia de la arquitectura española que aún no ha sido trabajado con la intensidad que merece, y estoy deseosa de poder escucharles en breves momentos. Y por último, unas palabras también de gratitud por todas las instituciones que han hecho posible desde sus bibliotecas y archivos que este proyecto pudiera llegar a buen puerto. Me refiero a los archivos y bibliotecas de escuelas de arquitectura de España, a los museos nacionales que nos han abierto también las puertas, como el Museo Nacional del Prado, y muy especialmente también a las academias de Bellas Artes. Sin toda esta suma de un esfuerzo colaborativo, seguramente no estaríamos hoy aquí, y es por eso que es un momento de celebración y de gran emoción. Sin más dilación, creo que es el turno de la profesora que va a abrir nuestra conferencia internacional, la profesora Mari Lendin. Ella es profesora catedrática de Historia de la Arquitectura en la Escuela de Arquitectura y Diseño de la Universidad de Oslo y la autoría de su monografía Plaster Monuments, The Architecture and the Power of Reproduction, editada por la Universidad de Princeton en el año 2017, es la que le hizo merecedora, sin ningún tipo de duda, para abrir precisamente este simposio con sus palabras y su conocimiento. Es en la actualidad también la presidenta de la prestigiosa Asociación de Historiadores de la Arquitectura, la European Architectural History Networks, y muy especialmente esta conferencia que va a impartir aquí hoy en el Museo Nacional del Prado es el punto de inicio de un proyecto de investigación de 4 años en curso que empieza ahora y que lleva por título Provenance Projected, Architecture Past and Future in the Era of Circularity. So it's a great pleasure, Mary, to welcome to the Prado Museum, and it's your turn. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolina. I think I understood everything that you said. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, not least, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and you will have to forgive me for delivering this keynote lecture in English. So it's wonderful, and it is also a bit bewildering to me to be here. Things has changed a lot since I fell into the plaster cast rabbit hole about 15 years ago, both in regards of archives, the availability of digitized catalogs, the number of scholars working on casts, and not least in the resurfacing of and knowledge about individual works and whole cast collections across the Western world. However, this is the first time I'm speaking to a room full of experts. Usually, I have kind of been on my own amongst art and architectural historians, the one person in the room insisting on the beauty and the profound importance of the lovely and sometimes weird world of what I have termed plaster monuments. In this exclusive context, there is no need to insist on the value of these objects, or to give any kind of overview on how many of the most important monuments in the world have been shaped in intricate entanglements of objects in and also ex situ, with the plaster casts as a vital medium and material in which monuments have been shaped, changed, restored, and also canonized. Their documentary, but also historical and theoretical value is priceless, and they certainly sign up for inclusion in the lives of buildings. So today, I will rather zoom in on one detail, on one very specific element in the portable Parthenon, the perhaps most famous and monumentalized monument in the world. You see that detail here on the screen. Yet, there is one thing I would like to state imminently. I assume that I speak for most of us when I claim that accounting for and trying to understand how these objects behave also helps us understand the ways in which replication and movement produces rather than decays value. That is at least one of the things I will try to show here today. And to me, this is crucially important, and if anyone should disagree, it is a favorite topic of discussion. I would like also to start on a self-critical note in regards of the subtitle of this book you see on the screen, Architecture and the Power of Reproduction, as this book was the obvious reason for Carolina inviting me here today. Book titles, as you all know, are often hard, and that was also the case here. There were so many things I wanted these few words to encompass and to evoke. I landed on reproduction in the subtitle, although I always felt it was a little bit off. In this good company, it should not be necessary to emphasize that a good plaster cast is really a production, not a reproduction, an object with its own claim to truth and to significance. They are authored, signed works made by the skilled formatori who provided schools and museums across the world with sculpture and architectural fragments from their city, their region, or country through catalogs or also by special commissions. Sometimes they became the official master plaster casters of monuments residing elsewhere, which is partly the case with the Parthenon. Anyways, these productions have very specific provenances, understood as the pedigrees and social lives of these itinerant objects, and this is also one of the things I will talk about today. Then, I've been falling in and out of a Parthenon project for many years, and it could be that this will be part of a little book. That book ID even has an editor who encouraged me to wrap that project up soon, as this is certainly the moment to do precisely that, as we are presently experiencing yet another intense moment in the life of what we call the Parthenon. However, within the frames of this new research project I'm directing, Provenance Projected, I'm working on a monograph tentatively called Auctioning Architecture, so let's see if I manage to pull off both books in parallel, but today I will, however, try to weave some threads from that auction project into the Parthenon trajectory. Yet I will start by zooming. Well, the detail I will zoom in on is what you see here, Metope number 31, from the south side of the Doric temple that was completed at the Athenian Acropolis in the 430s before Christ. This very piece was brought to England as the result of the operations of Thomas Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, who served as the UK ambassador to Constantinople from 1799 to 1803. Yet I will start by zooming out and begin in the very present with something that is also a classical provenance story, simply regarding the ownership of the Parthenon sculptures that have spent more than 2 centuries in London, and I will run through this briefly. Restitution is not really the issue here, and I will be talking about Parthenon provenances within a broader understanding of provenance beyond the ownership record of a valuable object. And this will be familiar to many of you, so I will do this short and sweet. This is Nicholas Cullinan with Courtney Love, recently appointed the new director of the British Museum. The overall referred to in this headline from The Guardian, and Cullinan's statement upon the announcement now recently in late March clearly also point to the Parthenon marbles. Cullinan, who is hired also to re-display the whole collection, talked about the most significant transformations, both architectural and intellectual, happening in any museum globally, and it goes without saying that this includes concluding the Parthenon problem, the oldest restitution case in the world. The debate on restitution has intensified the last few years, producing constant breaking news on what the British Museum now refers to as the Parthenon marbles, to downplay the imperial connotations of the eponymous collections and its precarious provenance. Following this is something of a thriller, including the recent series of secret, top-leveled talks between George Osborne, the chairman of the British Museum, and the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakis Mitsotakis. It's been 50 years since the return of the marbles became a legal national matter between England and Greece. The first formal claim was set forth by the Greek Minister of Culture, Melina Mercouri, in 1983, when the former actress was photographed crying in the Divine Gallery, effectively evoking a centuries-old tradition of travelers bursting into tears when ascending the Acropolis, exposed to the sublime ruin of the biggest Doric temple in the world. Yet, only the last 2 years has shown some real development in the case. January 2022, The Times, in an authoritative editorial, declared, "The sculptures belong in Athens, they should now return." In 2021, the Greek newspaper Tanea recovered that in 1986, the president of the Oxford Union, classics students Boris Johnson, in an Oxford magazine, characterized Lord Elgin's operations as unlawful, wholesale pillage, as he called it, and he continued with characteristic pathos, I'm quoting, "The Elgin marbles should leave this northern whiskey-drinking guilt culture and be displayed where they belong, in a country of bright sunshine and the landscape of Achilles." As Prime Minister, Johnson saw the matter differently. Quoting again, "The UK government has a firm, long-standing position on the sculptures, which is that they were legally acquired by Lord Elgin," he assured. Soon, John Osborne, the chairman of the British Museum, took the world by surprise when speaking against what has been the firm state of the museum for a very long time, based on the idea of the so-called Universal Museum, and he stated that there is a deal to be made. In the middle of the mess Liz Truss managed to place herself and her country in during her 49 days reign of the UK, she still took the time to ruling out any kind of deal with Greece. The present Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, sticks to the impossible position that the marbles will stay in London, but was completely undermined internationally when the almost activist Charles III was photographed with the PM at COP28 in Dubai in December, wearing a tie with the Greek flag, while reminding the world that Greek blood was flowing in his veins. The event was followed by diplomatic difficulties between the Greek and British prime ministers, to severe international embarrassment for Sunak. The Parthenon may teach us a lot about circulating monuments. The entanglement of the Pentelic marbles that originally made the Parthenon and their history of being circulated in plaster was an important part of turning the Parthenon into a portable antiquity. As a modern monument, the Parthenon is forever fluctuating both in situ and as fragmented exhibits, showcasing the intricate relations between ever-changing originals, what you see here, and their serialized reproductions across media. So let me now zoom in on this Metope number 31 and see what can be unfolded from that one fragment. Here you see it depicted in Athens in the early 19th century. Before an image, however old, the present never ceases to reshape, according to Georges Didi Iberman. Likewise, he continues, before an image, however recent, the past never ceases to reshape. So now I will try to take this idea of the shapes of the past in the present and of the present in the past as a key to talk about one of the most politicized monuments of our time. And I will try to look at this one fragment and consider it as a chronotope. The idea of thinking about plaster casts and their constellations in time and space dawned upon me 10 years ago when I spent a semester at the Yale School of Architecture trying to make sense of Paul Rudolph's eccentric, very eccentric mounting of Yale University's discarded cast collection. And that was when Mikhail Bakhtin's chronotope, coined a century ago, struck me as a possible and also useful trope to understand both the history, the historicity, and the effects of plaster casts. And this very collection, this American collection, had been brutally expelled from the former art school at Yale by Joseph Albers, who quite typically of the time found the casts both appalling and a threat to the creativity of young art and architecture students. I have recorded Albers' exiling of the collection and Rudolph's recovering and repurposing of the same works elsewhere. So we'll not really talk about that, only here give you a glimpse into the former school, where the Parthenon frieze and the pediment sculptures, all ordered from London, gave Joseph Albers a very hard time teaching Bauhaus pedagogies. 10 years ago, it appeared to me that Paul Rudolph's very capricious installation of architectural elements took on the form precisely of a Bakhtinian chronotope, a time-space concept that Bakhtin in the 1920s borrowed from Einstein's theory of relativity. It was almost a metaphor, almost but not entirely, he said. What you're looking at here is the Parthenon frieze, the very same casts as in the former image, mounted vertically in the stairwell at the school prior to the 2008 restoration. And to the right, and over the Xerox machine, some south side metapiece mounted together with brand new casts of the frieze from Louis Sullivan's Garrick Theatre in Chicago, demolished in 1961, photographed upon the inauguration of this building 2 years later, 1963, and then photographed again on the top 10 years ago. And back then, I was discussing the ways in which these objets trouvés are fused into a carefully thought out concrete whole across the 37 levels of Paul Rudolph's building as polychronic wonders. Involuntary, or perhaps subconsciously, Rudolph completely deprived the casts of the main purpose this kind of collection were meant to serve in both schools and in museums, namely to display 19th century art historical obsessions, first and foremost chronology, style, and evolution. Rudolph was simply captivated by the object's phenomenal aesthetic effects. Bakhtin's chronotopicity helped me explicate Rudolph's pairing of a cast of both cast concrete and plaster casts on this occasion, and the ways in which fractured temporalities articulated spaces of a very weird contemporaneity. Time, I'm quoting now, time becomes, in effect, palpable and visible. The chronotope makes narrative events concrete, makes them take on flesh, causes blood to flow in their veins, as Bakhtin beautifully puts it. The centerpiece in this image is metapiece number 32 from the series of 32 metapieces that originally sat on the south side of the Parthenon, depicting the Tauromachy, a mythical battle between Lapids and centaurs in deeply cut reliefs. During Lord Elgin's operations in Athens, his team brought 15 out of the 18 best preserved south-facing metopes to London from 1801 onwards. And I was recently revisiting this image, showing Louis-François Sébastien Fauvel, from 1803, the French vice consul to Athens, in a house he designed for himself, and realized that I had never really understood what I was looking at. Fauvel's house is considered the first museum in Athens, and thus an early museum in any respect. The house was damaged at the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, and then pilfered and completely destroyed in 1825. Trained as a painter in Paris, Fauvel first arrived in Athens in 1880 to work for Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, who was preparing his Voyage pittoresque de la Grèce. Choiseul was appointed the French ambassador to the Ottoman court in 1884, resigned in 1792, and spent a decade in exile in St. Petersburg. Fauvel, for his part, spent 50 years in Greece and environs, drawing, surveying, excavating, and collecting antiquities, first for Choiseul and then in other capacities. Everybody visiting Athens would visit his house. Among them, Louis Dupré, who in 1819 depicted Fauvel on the veranda here, overlooking the garden of his home museum. A lithographed version appeared in a book Dupré soon published back in Paris. This was in 1825, which is precisely what we're looking at on the screen. And the Acropolis in the backdrop is, of course, of the greatest importance, as is the metope in the foreground. If this image has any documentary value, and I believe that it does, it struck me as puzzling that this specific metope, depicting a centaur about to choke a lapith, was sitting on Fauvel's roof terrace, because this very metope number 31 had at the time been on display in different venues in London since 1807. This is the first public display of the so-called Elgin marbles in London in a provisional shed at Elgin's London residence at the corner of Park Lane and Piccadilly. Unfortunately, Cockerell's drawing does not pay detailed attention to the metopes, but the real thing was in this space and then in a series of other London venues the next few years. Crowds arrived to see this world sensation, and from all over Europe, up to 1,000 people visited a day. While Dupré was depicting Fauvel and his metope 31 in Athens in 1819, the Elgin collection was on display in the Elgin Gallery, what you see here, an ephemeral structure designed by Robert Smirke, the future architect of the British Museum, on the same plot in Bloomsbury. And Smirke had in fact visited Athens on his grand tour in 1801 and was an eyewitness to the detaching of the same objects he was later designed the exhibition spaces for. To the upper right here, you see metope number 32, our metope's neighbor. And here, a famous painting of the apsis of the same space, showing metope number 30 on the upper right side. Antonio Canova, who was asked already in 1802, I believe, if he would restore the marbles in Rome, something he resolutely declined to do. Canova first encountered the Parthenon in November 1815, when the collection was displayed in the courtyard of Burlington House in London. It was, however, in this very space, in 1818, that Quatremère de Quincy felt that he was catapulted back to the construction site, or in fact to Phidias' studio, as he puts it, praising the decontextualized fragment's power to evoke the totality better than the real thing in situ. This was, as you know, may know at least, an immense break with the anti-museum philosophy that Quatremer presented in bold, written diatribes against Napoleon's removal of Roman art to French museums in the 1790s. When volume 4 of Stuart and Rivette appeared very belated and posthumously in 1816, the engraved metapies were modified after the originals in London, as displayed in Bloomsbury. The shape of the metopie in Duprer's image is a bit odd, and I slowly realized that we are looking at a plaster cast, and probably one of the first casts ever made from the Parthenon. As it turned out, from 1886 onwards, Choiseul-Gouffier had Fauvel, who had no experience in molding or casting whatsoever, reproduce sculptures and inscriptions at the Acropolis. These casts were very heavy and incredibly fragile, and many of them broke en route from Piraeus to Marseille, heading for Paris between 1787 and 1791. Fauvel also collected marbles for Choiseul-Gouffier, among them metopie number 10 from the south side that was found on the ground, as well as the central piece of the Panathenea frieze. And 3 of these heads fell off when Fauvel was thinning the slab to ease the transport to France. Interestingly, this French piece served as the frontispiece for the memorandum that Lord Elgin prepared while spending 3 years as a prisoner of war in France from 1803, on his way back home, while planning the possible sale of the collection. The memorandum was first printed in 1810, followed by a series of editions. And until the Congress of Vienna and the Battle of Waterloo, the race for antiquities was, of course, part of the decades-long British-French wars. The fact that Lord Elgin, who was in possession of 75 meters of the original 160 meters long Parthenon frieze, made the one French piece his frontispiece, hints at the interesting exchanges between French and British collectors while their nations were at war. Anyway, here is the original marble in the British Museum, the cast on display at the Acropolis Museum in Athens, and Fauvel's cast. Fauvel kept several of these casts at his home museum, where they were destroyed with the house in 1825. When Lord Elgin was appointed ambassador to the Ottoman court, he very time-typically planned on collecting antiquities, initially to embellish Broomhall, his mansion in Scotland. The rest is history. In 1816, the British Parliament purchased the collection and deposited it in the British Museum after intense petitions and public hearings and to massive critique by central players in UK arts and also politics regarding both the legal and moral implications of the acquisition. As time typically, the British ambassador traveled with an entourage, with competencies beyond those required to improve UK-Ottoman relations. This part of the mission was also added by Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in July 1798 and the Franco-Turkish War, which led to the arrest and expulsion of French residents in Ottoman Athens, Fauvel amongst them. And these geopolitical shifts further facilitated the collection endeavor. Elgin's team even confiscated Fauvel's scaffolding and his cart, which were crucial for transporting the marbles as well as the molds to Piraeus. Until the outbreak of the Anglo-Turkish War in 1807, Elgin's team enjoyed much easier access to the Acropolis than the French competition ever had. Untypically, however, Lord Elgin's entourage included not only 2 architects and the painter Giovanni Battista Lucieri, who supervised the work and shipped the last dispatch of 86 crates from Piraeus in 1811, and his secretary, William Richard Hamilton, but also 2 professional formatori, Bernardino Ledus and Vincenzo Rosati, whom Hamilton had contracted in Rome. Plan A, according to a first agreement with the Ottoman authorities, was to document and measure the site by drawings and plaster casts, as well as to remove certain loose figures from the ground. However, the venture soon developed into a full-fledged archaeological excavation. The team demolished houses, excavated the ground, and erected scaffolding to detach substantial pieces of the metapiece, the frieze, and the pediment sculpture, and at times 300 to 400 locals worked under Lucieri's command. The process of detaching and lowering of the metapiece were recorded by appalled British grand tourists at the time. Both William Gell and Edward Dodwell and many other British travelers soon published their harsh criticism of Elgin's operation. This, what you see here, is Edward Dodwell documenting the lowering of Metapi number 27, July 1801. And here, William Gell depicts the same scene with ladders and scaffolding. And even the British Museum, in the first catalogues prepared on the collection in the 1830s for emerging museum audiences, referred to the extensive dilapidations that Lord Elgin had committed upon the Parthenon. In this watercolor from 1803, Lucieri documents the last 3 metapiece on the south side, namely number 30, 31, 32, that were cut off the entablature that autumn. In 1816, the British Museum also secured the molds made by Ledus and Rosati in Athens, documenting most parts of the frieze and the metapiece that they were unable to remove. Once cast in London, they initiated a prolific tradition of disseminating the Parthenon in academies, schools, museums, and domestic spaces across the Western world. Together with new casts produced in Athens and subsequent series produced in London throughout the 19th century, these constantly updated productions form an intrinsic part of the biography of the itinerant Parthenon. They are signed by individual formatori, although their authors have not been much described. The Parthenon casts played a role in the polychromy debate, aided the work to reconstruct the much damaged frieze and metapiece, and served always as 3D recordings. Despite these disastrous conservation scandals that has taken place at the British Museum, the British loved to compare their pristine casts with the worn Greek originals, which suffered from casual vandalism, pilfering tourists, and since the 1960s, pollution. In London, until World War II, the marbles were always shown with plaster casts. The Parthenon galleries served as laboratories for understanding the fragment's original architectural setting, and new fragments identified in Athens or elsewhere were cast and ensembled in constantly rearranged ensembles. Today, these objects occasionally appear at high-end auctions. Here, Christie's in London are auctioning off a number of Parthenon casts, originally installed in a country house by John Soane. The provenance is correctly here given as Domenico Bruciani. And here is Metapi, number 32, auctioned at Sotheby's in New York in 2006. The auction house did not provide the provenance, but it was purchased by the Metropolitan Museum in 1891 from the same Domenico Bruciani in London. Let's return to Fauvel's house. The other thing that struck me when understanding that the centerpiece in this image is a cast was how strangely familiar this prospect appears. What we see is a plaster fragment from the Parthenon in a very specific relation to the Acropolis. Now, have a look at this more familiar space, displaying the same relationship of plaster casts to the temple above. This is the Parthenon Gallery at the top of the British Museum, of the Acropolis Museum, designed by Bernard Chimy and inaugurated in 2009. It embodies the competition brief that read as a political legal manifest in disguise back then, effectively declaring war on the British Museum. According to the brief, I'm quoting, "The return of the so-called Elgin marbles necessitates the creation of corresponding areas for their display." So Chimy translated this demand into a compelling architectural rhetoric and a building whose most striking feature is the display of the collection which the museum does not possess. Situated 300 meters from the Acropolis and bathed in attic light, the weathered, honey-colored original fragments in Pentelic marble are juxtaposed with uniformly white plaster cast that references the originals in London. The visual contrast delivers a message that is clear even to audiences without any particular interest in repatriation issues. So here, differently from the proud plaster metope in Fauvel's house and in Dupré's image, the point is simply to show how terrible plaster looks compared to marble. While a new series presented by the British government to the King of Greece in the 1840s is today in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, the provenance of these casts is hard to track down, although I have my suspicions. Anyway, I first thought that Fauvel's house was situated near the site of the Acropolis Museum, making the plaster gesture of the new museum almost a repetition of the first museum in Athens. But that is not the case, I soon understood, as there was no city south of the Acropolis at the turn of the 18th century. Fauvel himself provides the proof. This is his map of Athens from 1787, much reprinted. Looking closer at the Acropolis, we see the Propylaea to the right, that is to the east. And this lovely house and garden sat at the northwest of the hill in the vicinity of the ancient Agora, while the Acropolis Museum sits on the south side. Still, the views are strikingly similar, and I find it intriguing that those two very different plaster editions of Metope 31 establishes the same relation to the temple. Let me share one other peculiar appearance of this very metope. At the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a full-scale cast of the southeast corner of the Parthenon was in place for the 1877 inauguration of Félix Dubin's glass-covered courtyard. The awe-inspiring object was commissioned by the Commission des Monuments Historiques and translated into 3 dimensions under the supervision of the school's chief molder, Alexandre Desacy, from drawings made during a French archaeological expedition in 1844. The monument was reproduced twice and shipped off to London and to Moscow. At the British Museum, only the entablature is awkwardly tucked away in a corridor outside of the Divine Gallery, while the whole thing is still on display at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And I love the photos of this plaster monument, this plaster Parthenon. But when Metope 31 South now caught my interest. I realized that it is in fact misplaced on this gargantuan cast. Weirdly, number 31 and 32 has changed places so that 31 now sits on the corner. I have no idea why that is the case. My guess is that it is a mix-up by those who were puzzling the pieces together on the scaffold in Paris. Another thing I don't know is if these metopes were ordered from London or if they might be recast from the ones that Fauvel made in Athens and shipped to Paris around 1790. However, the Louvre does not state the provenance of their plaster metopes. The lapsus is anyway fascinating. To conclude, my discovery of Louis Fauvel's Metope 31, prominently displayed in his home museum in Athens and preserved in 2 dimensions by Louis Dupré, challenged my previous beliefs about the earliest Parthenon casts. This is Stanley House in Chelsea, London, auctioned at Bonhams in 2021. Although not emphasized on the provided photograph, Metope 31 features prominently over the mantelpiece in what was once the residence of William Hamilton, Lord Elgin's secretary in Constantinople. At a young age, Hamilton oversaw the shipment of the marbles to London, as well as the Rosetta Stone and other antiquities that the French had stored at Alexandria when the English claimed the Egyptian loot for the British Museum. Hamilton, who later emerged as a figure in UK international affairs, early on and obviously ordered the first edition cast of Metope number 31 to embellish his home. The Parthenon fragments are truly historical. Their historicity is part of their power and their beauty. The many reproductions hold their own significance, especially as we witness now another dramatic moment in the Parthenon's adventurous life. The additions of casts also testifies to the exchange of knowledge, and particularly between Athens and London, an exchange which has surprisingly never been considered a possible diplomatic ground in the debates on restitution. The rich trajectory of the portable Parthenon, traveling across time, place, media, and materials, serialized or singular, with their own claims to truth and significance, shows how a variety of space-time configurations may be embodied in one fragment, in this case in Metope number 31, and in very concrete ways. Quoting again, "Time, as it were, thickens," Bakhtin wrote a century ago, characterizing the chronotope. It takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible, while space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. End quote. When time thickens and takes on flesh, as Bakhtin puts it, chronology falls short in understanding the afterlives of these performative productions. History is effective and real even as chronology is bent and folded, as Alexander Nagel aptly puts it. New configurations of problems and objects are taking shape before our eyes. That insight indeed captures the many states of the Parthenon with its intricate history and provenances. Thank you.